Her instruments said the water was pure, but it brought madness and death. The townspeople blamed an angry spirit, a superstition she was sent to debunk. But their ancient journals held a secret. Not a myth, but a precise calendar of death repeating for 200 years. What if their folklore wasn't a story, but a perfect scientific observation? What if the only thing more dangerous than a curse was proving it was real? The silence in Dean Atherton's office was a physical thing, thick and heavy, like unshed humidity. It clung to the leather-bound books that lined the walls, books Dr. Kaelen Reed had once revered. Now they seemed to mock her from the shelves. She stood ramrod straight, her hands clasped behind her back to keep them from trembling, her gaze fixed on the dense grain of the oak desk that separated her from her former mentor. Atherton refused to meet her eye. His attention was on a thin, beige folder, which he nudged across the polished surface with the tips of his fingers, as if repulsed by its touch. "The assignment is off the books, Kaelen. A favor for a sensitive government contact." Kaelen's eyes flickered to the folder. Her name wasn't T on it. Nothing was. "What is it?" Her voice was clipped, a carefully constructed wall of professionalism. It was the only defense she had left. "A water contamination issue," Atherton said, finally looking up. His eyes were devoid of their old warmth, replaced by a weary pragmatism. "A town. Remote. Sanctuary Valley. They've had an outbreak of some kind. Hysteria. Illness. They were blaming the water from a local spring." He leaned back, the leather of his chair groaning in the quiet room. "They need a geochemist. Someone discreet. Someone who can provide a definitive, data-driven conclusion." The unspoken words hung in the air between them, sharp and clear as glass shards. Someone with nothing left to lose. Someone who can be disavowed if things go wrong. Again, the memory of the Viridian spill, her name forever tied to a catastrophic data miscalculation. To ecological devastation she was meant to prevent rose in her throat like bile. She had trusted her model. She had trusted her intuition. Both had betrayed her. Data, raw and irrefutable, was all that remained. "I'll need full access to my mobile lab," she stated, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. Atherton gave a curt nod. "It's already being prepped. Get in, get the samples, analyze the water, find the toxin. Write a report that puts the matter to rest. No speculation, no grand theories." He paused, his gaze hardening. "Just the data. Am I clear?" "Perfectly." Kaelen picked up the folder. It felt as heavy as a tombstone. This wasn't a second chance. It was a leash, a short one. The road into Sanctuary Valley was less a road and more a scar. It twisted deep into a narrow gorge, a claustrophobic canyon of grey rock and ancient, monolithic trees whose thick canopies knitted together overhead, plunging the path into a perpetual twilight. Kaelen's mobile research vehicle, a machine of precise angles and reinforced steel, seemed like an intruder here, an artifact from another world. Inside, the atmosphere was sterile, controlled. Banks of monitors glowed with a cool blue light. Kaelen ignored the oppressive, almost sentient wilderness pressing in on the armored windows. Her world was the tablet in her hand, a screen displaying geological surveys of the region. "Anomalous felsic intrusions," she muttered to herself, her finger tracing a contour line. High concentrations of lithium-bearing pegmatites could lead to groundwater leaching, but the pH levels wouldn't support acute toxicity. Her mind was a sanctuary of process, a fortress built of methodology and metrics. The world outside was messy, irrational. A landscape like this inspired folklore, ghost stories. But ghosts couldn't be quantified. Folklore couldn't be run through a mass spectrometer. The fear that gnawed at her, the fear of failing again, could be silenced only by the clean, unambiguous hum of her equipment. The vehicle's heavy-duty tires crunched over the gravel, kicking up a plume of dust that swirled in the dim light. a temporary disturbance in a place that felt like it had never been disturbed at all. Sanctuary's town square was a pocket of unnatural silence. Kaelen parked the imposing research vehicle in front of a modest town hall, the vehicle's diesel engine rumbling to a halt with a hydraulic sigh that sounded deafeningly loud. The buildings were old, constructed from dark timber and riverstone, their eaves carved with strange, geometric symbols that weren't quite decorative. They looked like warnings. A young man in a sheriff's uniform hurried out to meet her. He couldn't have been more than 25, his face a mixture of boyish features and grown-up anxiety. "Dr. Reed, I am Sheriff Carter, Ben." He offered a hand, his grip earnest and slightly damp. "Thank God you're here. We're in over our heads." "I need to see your water source and any affected residents," Kaelen said, her tone polite but brisk. "I'll set up my equipment here. It is a self-contained biosafety level 2 lab." As Carter began to lead her across the square, a figure emerged from the shadows of the general store, blocking their path. He was an older man, tall and wiry, with a face that seemed carved from the same hard stone as the mountains. His eyes, dark and piercing, fixed on Kaelen, then flicked to her vehicle with undisguised contempt. "We don't need your machines," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Sheriff Carter flinched. "Malachi, this is Dr. Reed. She's here to help." "Help?" Malachi Thorne stepped closer, his gaze locking onto Kaelen S. "The sickness is not in the water. It is a consequence. Payment for trespass." He gestured vaguely toward the mountains that ringed the valley. "Your kind came a month ago, the survey team. With their drills and their explosions, waking what should be left to sleep. The guardian of the spring is angered. The land is soured by your presence." Kaelen felt a familiar wave of condescending pity. Superstition, the last refuge of those without answers. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice dripping with clinical patience, "I assure you, geological surveys don't anger spirits. They provide data. I deal in data, not folklore. A toxin is a molecule, not a metaphor. I will find it." Malachi's lips curled into a semblance of a smile, but it held no warmth. "You will find only what you bring with you, Doctor. Hubris and dust." He turned his back on her and walked away, melting back into the shadows from which he came, leaving a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the mountain altitude. Sheriff Carter led her away from the square, down a well-worn path that wound through a copse of whispering aspen trees. The air grew cooler, filled with the scent of damp earth and moss. They emerged into a sun-dappled clearing, and Kaelen saw it, the spring. It was deceptively beautiful. Water bubbled up from a fissure in a flat expanse of grey rock, collecting in a perfectly clear, serene pool, before trickling away in a small creek. The pool was surrounded by a circle of waist-high stones, weathered and ancient, covered in the same strange carvings as the buildings in town. The place felt sacred, primal. Kaelen pushed the feeling aside. It was an aesthetic reaction, not a scientific one. She knelt by the pool, the hard plastic case of her sample kit clicking open. Inside, sterile vials and digital sensors lay nestled in custom-cut foam. This was her church, her ritual. "They say the water has healing properties," Carter said quietly, watching her. Or it did. People would travel for miles. Kaelen didn't respond. She was unscrewing the cap from a vial, her movements economical and precise, when a scream tore through the tranquility of the clearing. A young woman, no older than 20, stumbled out from the trees on the far side of the spring. Her clothes were torn, her hair wild. It was her eyes, though, that seized Kaelen's breath. They were wide with a terror so profound it seemed to be looking at a different reality entirely. "The faces," the woman shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the empty woods. "They re-in the trees! They re-wearing my skin!" She staggered forward, her gaze dropping to the ground at her feet. "No, no, not glassed on to let it break." She was hallucinating, vividly, the textbook definition of a psychotropic agent. Kaelen's mind instantly began categorizing, hypothesizing. Ergot fungus, a rare alkaloid from a local plant? The woman, whom Carter whispered was named Sarah, took another lurching step before her eyes rolled back in her head. Her body went rigid, and she collapsed to the ground, thrashing in the violent, unforgiving throes of a grand mal seizure. In a heartbeat, Kaelen's scientific detachment shattered. She dropped the sample vial and scrambled around the pool, her mind stripped of everything but the raw, human imperative to help. She reached Sarah's side, turning her to prevent her from choking, her hands feeling the horrifying, uncontrolled power of the convulsions racking the young woman's body. For the first time since she arrived, Kaelen wasn't a disgraced scientist or an impartial observer. She was a witness, kneeling in the dirt, face to face with the terrifying, inexplicable madness that was consuming the town of Sanctuary. The image of Sarah's seizure was seared onto the back of Kaelen's eyelids. The raw, uncontrollable violence of it, the terror in her eyes. Back inside the hermetic seal of her mobile lab, Kaelen fought to cage that chaos within the precise, logical framework of her science. This was a fortress of order against the madness she had just witnessed. For hours, she worked with a furious, laser-like focus, the rhythmic hum of the machinery, a calming mantra against the memory of the screams. The water from the spring, the supposed source of the horror, flowed through the intricate glass tubing of a gas chromatograph. A monitor displayed the results. A flat line, no volatile organic compounds, nothing. She prepared another sample for the mass spectrometer, a $1 million machine capable of identifying a single anomalous molecule out of billions. It analyzed, it processed, it hummed its expensive analytical song, and it found nothing. Impossible, Kaelen whispered, her voice hoarse. She ran the tests again, and again. She cross-referenced the results with the Valley's geological data, searching for any possible interaction, any rare mineral that could produce a previously unknown neurotoxin when combined with an organic catalyst. The data remained stubbornly, infuriatingly silent. The water was clean, pristine. It was purer than the filtered, bottled water she drank herself. Frustration mounted, hot and sharp. Every principle of her profession told her there had to be a cause, a measurable, quantifiable agent of this suffering. The scientific method was a map, and she had followed it perfectly, yet it had led her to a blank space. The thought, insidious and terrifying, began to creep in. What if the map was wrong? What if the fault wasn't in the water, but in her inability to ask the right questions of it? She stared at the screen displaying the water's molecular structure, simple, elegant H2O, and felt a profound, unnerving sense of failure. It was the Viridian spill all over again, a ghost whispering in her ear that she was missing something vital, something staring her right in the face. The next day, Kaelen put on a crisp white lab coat, an armor of authority, and went to the town hall. The large wood-paneled room had been converted into a makeshift clinic. The air was thick with the smell of sickness and fear. Half a dozen residents lay on cots, their faces slack, their eyes staring at horrors no one else could see. A low, continuous moaning provided a grim soundtrack. Sheriff Carter met her by the door, his young face etched with exhaustion. "Any luck, Doc?" "The water is clean," Kaelen said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Which means the infection vector is something else. I need to take blood samples. I need to look for biological markers, a virus, a prion, anything that could be causing the neurological breakdown." Carter's face fell. He shifted his weight, avoiding her eyes. That S going to be a problem. Malachi, he has already spoken to the families. Kaelen's jaw tightened. Spoken to them about what? He told them the sickness is an affliction of the spirit, brought on by the Guardian's anger, Carter explained, his voice barely a whisper. He said it cannot be found in the blood, that letting you take their blood would be a desecration, that it would invite the sickness in deeper. A flash of hot anger shot through Kaelen. A desecration? Sheriff, people are dying. This isn't the time for campfire stories. We are dealing with a medical crisis that requires evidence-based procedure. I need samples. It's the only way. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet misery of the room. An old woman on a nearby cot whimpered and turned her face to the wall. Kaelen saw the judgment in Carter's eyes, the way he looked at her not as a savior, but as an intruder. It was then she understood the true depth of her problem. Malachi wasn't just a superstitious old man. He was their shield, and she, with her cold science and sharp needles, was the threat he was protecting them from. Drawn by a sound she first mistook for the wind, Kaelen walked towards the spring as dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the sky. It wasn't the wind, it was chanting, a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in her bones. Through the trees, she saw a dozen townspeople standing in a semicircle around the pool, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of handheld lanterns. In the center stood Malachi Thorne. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, casting handfuls of dark, dried herbs into the pristine water. His voice rose and fell in a rhythmic cadence, speaking words in a language Kaelen didn't recognize, ancient and guttural. This was not the act of a charlatan trying to fool a gullible crowd. He performed the rite with a deep, unshakable conviction, his entire being focused on the act. He was communing with his god, or his spirit, or whatever he believed lived in the water. He must have sensed her presence. He paused, his head turning slightly, and his eyes found her in the shadows of the trees. They held a silent, potent challenge. He didn't stop the ritual. He simply acknowledged her, the outsider, the non-believer, before turning his focus back to the spring. Kaelen felt a dismissive scoff rise in her throat. She lifted her tablet, its screen a jarring blue rectangle in the fading light, and began recording. She made notes, documenting the type of herbs, the cadence of the chant, the position of the stones. She would debunk this. She would analyze the herbs, prove them to be inert. She would cross-reference the ritual with anthropological texts on primitive appeasement ceremonies. She would drain the magic from it, leaving only the dry husk of desperation and fear. She saw a ritual. He saw a solution, and the gulf between them felt as wide and as deep as the valley itself. A frantic, percussive banging on the door of her vehicle jolted Kaelen from a fitful, shallow sleep. She scrambled from her bunk, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was Sheriff Carter, his face pale and slick with rain in the harsh glare of the exterior light. "It's a Sarah," he said, his voice cracking. "She's gone, Doc. She died about an hour ago." The words hit Kaelen like a physical blow. Dead. The girl from the spring. The first official casualty of the sanctuary plague. A wave of nausea and failure washed over her. She stumbled back into the lab, her breath catching in her throat. She had failed. The thought was a drumbeat in her head. Failed. 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 Ignoring Carter's worried questions, she turned to her monitors, her mind racing. It had to be environmental, something hidden, something old. She pulled up a detailed historical map of the valley, her fingers flying across the screen. She scanned for forgotten mine shafts that could be leaching arsenic or mercury. She looked for signs of old industrial waste dumps, illegal landfills, anything that could poison the groundwater from a hidden source. Nothing. The valley was, and always had been, virtually untouched. As she worked, a deep-seated exhaustion settling into her bones, she absently reached for a bottle of water. It was from her vehicle's own filtration system, a multi-stage process of reverse osmosis and UV sterilization that could make sewage drinkable. It was the safest water in the whole valley. She took a long drink, the cool liquid a small comfort in the suffocating closeness of the lab. She set the bottle down on the console, her attention already back on the maps. She didn't see it. No one could have. On the intake valve of the filtration system, where the outside air met the machine, a faint, almost invisible sheen of slick biofilm had been growing for 2 days, a microscopic colonization from the Valley's unique, spore-rich atmosphere. And now, it was inside the vehicle, inside the water, inside her. Science had failed. The thought echoed in the sterile confines of Kaelen's lab, a conclusion as irrefutable as any of her test results. Sarah was dead. The water was clean. Every logical path she had followed had led to a sheer cliff face. She was out of data, out of theories, out of time. There was only one avenue left, one she had dismissed with arrogant certainty, and the thought of exploring it now felt like a profound intellectual defeat. Humiliation burned in her chest, but it was overshadowed by the cold dread of utter failure. Swallowing her pride, she left the safety of her lab and walked toward the heart of the town. The town archives were housed in a small, neglected building behind the town hall. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust and decaying paper. And standing there, bathed in the murky light filtering through a grimy window, was Malachi Thorne. He seemed to be waiting for her, his presence as ancient and patient as the valley itself. He didn't speak. He simply inclined his head toward a tall, precarious stack of leather-bound journals resting on a heavy wooden table. Their covers were cracked and faded, their pages yellowed with age. "The town records," he said, his voice a low rumble. He looked at Kaelen, his eyes holding no triumph, only a deep, weary understanding. "Your science seeks a single event, a cause, a snapshot in time." He gestured to the books. "Our memory is longer." Without another word, he turned and left, the door creaking shut behind him, leaving Kaelen alone in the suffocating silence. She stared at the journals, a repository of what she had scorned as primitive folklore. Her every instinct, every ounce of her training, screamed at her to turn around, to get back to her lab and find the rational explanation she knew had to exist. But there was nowhere else to go. With a feeling of bitter surrender, she reached out a trembling hand and opened the first book. The next few days blurred into a single obsessive quest. Kaelen barely ate or slept, her mobile lab becoming a frantic nexus of old-world text and new-world technology. She set up a high-resolution scanner, carefully digitizing page after fragile page of the town's journals. What she found astounded her. This wasn't a collection of myths or ghost stories. It was a meticulous, multi-generational logbook of the valley itself. The entries tracked crop yields, rainfall, animal migrations, and human health, all framed around the temperament of the spring, which the journals referred to as the breath. They wrote of the pure breath, when the water was sweet and life in the valley flourished. And they wrote, in cramped, fearful script, of the poison breath. The descriptions of the poison breath were chillingly specific, detailing periods of madness, paranoia, and a sickness that caused the body to decay from within. The symptoms were identical to those afflicting Sanctuary now. The journals spoke of it not as a curse, but as a predictable season, a recurring winter of the soul. Working with a feverish intensity, Kaelen extracted the dates of every recorded poison breath cycle. She hacked into state archives, pulling up official mortality records for the county going back over 200 years. Then she began to cross-reference. The correlation was immediate. It was perfect. Every single spike in the county's unexplained death rate, every historical mention of a wasting sickness or valley madness, lined up perfectly with the dates of the poison breath recorded in the journals. It was a data set, hidden in the language of superstition, a 200-year-long observational study of a cyclical plague. Kaelen stared at her monitor, where she had mapped the data. It formed a terrifyingly perfect wave, a sine curve of life and death, cresting and crashing with a rhythm as predictable as the tide. The people of Sanctuary hadn't been superstitious. They had been keeping records. Night had fallen. The only light in the lab came from the monitor, its glow casting long shadows across the cramped space. Kaelen stared at the finished timeline, the wave function of death that pulsed on the screen. It was the most important discovery of her life, and it terrified her to her core. Her face, reflected in the dark screen, was a mask of scientific awe and primal horror. A sudden wave of intense dizziness washed over her. The room tilted, the glowing lines on the screen blurring into a smear of light. She gripped the edge of her console to steady herself, her breath catching in her throat. She looked down at her hand, and for a gut-wrenching, heart-stopping second she saw it. Through the skin, her own veins were glowing with a faint, sickly green luminescence, a phantom light that pulsed in time with her frantic heartbeat. She blinked hard, shaking her head, and it was gone. Her hand was just a hand, pale, trembling, but normal. Exhaustion, she whispered, the word sounding hollow and unconvincing in the silence. Dehydration, lack of sleep. She clung to the rational explanations, the clinical diagnoses. But a cold seed of fear had been planted in the pit of her stomach. The line between observer and observed had just vanished. She had the pattern, but now the pattern had her. She had to go back, not with a sample kit or a sensor array, but with the knowledge she now possessed. Under the cold light of a full moon, Kaelen walked to the spring, clutching one of the ancient journals to her chest like a shield. The place was different now, transformed. She looked at the circle of carved stones, and this time, she didn't see primitive decorations. She recognized the symbols from the journals, the spiral that denoted the pure breath, the jagged line that meant the poison breath, the phases of the moon that marked the turning of the cycles. It was a calendar, a 200-year-old warning. Driven by a fading echo of her old self, she pulled out her most sensitive equipment, a Geiger counter, which remained eerily silent, an atmospheric sensor, which returned a string of nonsensical, fluctuating readings that defied all logic. Her instruments, her connection to the rational world, were useless here. They were the wrong tools for the wrong reality. Giving in to an impulse she didn't understand, she knelt at the edge of the pool. The moon's reflection shattered on the rippling surface. She reached out and dipped her fingers into the water. It was cold, so cold it felt like a jolt of electricity. And then the vision hit her. It wasn't a flicker this time, it was an explosion. The world dissolved, and she saw the valley not as rock and trees, but as a single, colossal, living organism. She saw the network of roots and mycelium beneath the soil, as its nervous system, glowing with a faint green light. She saw the spring not as a geological feature, but as a beating heart, pulsing with a slow, ancient rhythm, drawing up the very lifeblood of the earth. The entire valley was breathing, and she was a microbe floating in its lung. Kaelen snatched her hand back from the water with a strangled cry, scrambling away from the pool, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was on her knees in the damp soil, gasping for breath. The world slowly resolving back into familiar shapes. But it was too late. Science had not just failed, it had surrendered. Her senses, the final bastion of empirical evidence, were now as unreliable as her broken instruments. She was adrift, caught between two worlds, and the tide of madness was rising fast. The vision at the spring had broken something inside Kaelen. The orderly, rational world she had inhabited for 30 years had been a fiction, a thin veneer of logic stretched over a reality that was ancient, alive, and utterly indifferent to her understanding of it. Now that veneer was torn, and the madness was pouring in. Her mobile research vehicle, once a sanctuary of sterile order, now reflected the chaos in her mind. Scattered notes and half-eaten rations littered every surface. The air was stale and close. She was deteriorating, and she knew it. A persistent, low-grade fever left her skin feeling clammy, and a tremor had taken up permanent residence in her hands. She sat huddled before her main monitor, trying to force the terrifying, beautiful wave function she'd discovered into a predictive model. The ancient journals had given her the rhythm of the plague, but not its trigger, not the key to what ended the cycle of poison. The pages were maddeningly vague on that point, speaking only of a time of cleansing, and a final rite. The whispers started subtly, a soft hiss from the spectrometer that sounded like her name, a low murmur from the air filtration unit that echoed the damning questions of reporters. The ghosts of her past had found her in this isolated valley. She'd close her eyes and be back in that press conference auditorium. The flashbulbs like strobing starbursts, the accusations raining down on her. "Dr. Reed, is it true your miscalculation led to the Viridian spill?" The faces of the angry journalists would twist and melt, becoming the hollow-eyed faces of Sanctuary S dead, all of them whispering the same terrible judgment. Failed, failed, failed. Her mind, her greatest asset, was now a torture chamber, its walls built from her own trauma and crumbling under the assault of an enemy she couldn't measure. She had to make someone understand. Clutching a printout of her cyclical chart, Kaelen stumbled out into the daylight, which felt painfully bright. She found Sheriff Carter outside his office, his face grim. He was carving a new name into a rough wooden plank, another marker for another grave. "Carter," she said, her voice raspy. She held out the chart. "Look, you have to see this." He took the paper, his brow furrowed in confusion at the complex graph. "It's a pattern," Kaelen explained, her words coming too fast, tripping over each other. "A predictable biological event. It's tied to the seasons, but not in a way we'd normally measure. The breath, as your town calls it. It is not random. It's a cycle. See the wave? We're nearing the apex, but there's a missing variable, a cancelling agent, something that initiates the downturn." She trailed off, realizing how she must sound. Her scientific language was peppered with the town S folklore, a frantic, nonsensical hybrid. Carter wasn't looking at the chart anymore. He was looking at her, and in his eyes, she saw not understanding, but a deep, sorrowful pity. "Doc," he said softly, "we've lost 3 more people since yesterday. Malachi is preparing what he calls the final rite. He says it's the last chance." He handed the chart back to her, his gaze full of a terrible gentleness. "You should get some rest. You look just like the others did, right before the end." The words struck her with more force than any physical blow. She wasn't the visiting scientist anymore. She wasn't the expert from the outside world. She was just another one of them. Another of Sanctuary S ghosts in waiting, speaking in tongues that no one could comprehend. She was completely, utterly alone. There was only one person left to turn to. Breaking Point wasn't a cliff you fell from. It was a quiet, desolate shoreline you washed up on, stripped of everything. As dusk settled, Kaelen walked through the silent town to Malachi Thorne's small, neat home. She left her instruments, her tablet, her identity as a scientist, behind in the lab. She brought only one thing, the chart she had printed, the wave function of his people's history. He opened the door before she could knock, as if he'd been expecting her. She didn't offer a handshake. She simply held out the paper. "This is your history," she said, her voice quiet, stripped of all its former arrogance, translated into my language. He took it, his long, weathered fingers tracing the sine wave. Kaelen took a shuddering breath. "My science has failed," she admitted, the confession a release of a great and terrible weight. "I can see the pattern, but I can define the cause. I can find a cure. My instruments don't work here. I'm sick." She finally looked him in the eye, her own gaze pleading. "I'm not here as a scientist. I am asking for help." She swallowed, her throat tight. "What does the ritual do? What are you putting in the water?" Malachi looked from the chart to Kaelen's pale, sweat-slicked face, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than suspicion in his eyes. He gave a slow, deliberate nod and stepped back, holding the door open for her. Inside, his home was simple, lit by the warm glow of an oil lamp. He laid her chart on a small wooden table with a reverence that surprised her. "You have good eyes," he said. "You saw the river. Most only see the stones." He tapped the paper. The breath is not a spirit to be killed. You cannot kill a season. It is a cycle, and it must be persuaded to turn. The rite, it is a way of reminding the spring of its true nature. He led her into a back room. The air was dry and fragrant, thick with the scent of drying plants. Bunches of strange herbs and flowers hung from the rafters. On a long table, laid out on a worn leather cloth, were dozens of small crystalline rocks, each one a different hue, some milky white, some streaked with veins of dark blue, others a pale mossy green. "The land gives the sickness," Malachi said, picking up one of the green stones. "And it gives the cure. The rite requires a specific combination of these salts and these herbs, ground into a powder." He looked at her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "It is the only way to cleanse the breath." He paused. "You wish to see, to understand, then you will help." A crowd of silent shadows stood gathered in the moonlight. Every resident of Sanctuary was at the spring, their faces pale and anxious in the soft, flickering glow of the lanterns they held. The air was heavy, still, and deathly quiet, thick with a collective, unspoken prayer. At the edge of the pool, on the flat stone worn smooth by generations of his ancestors, stood Malachi Thorne. Beside him stood Kaelen Reed. The fever still burned in her veins, but it was banked by a new fire, a razor-sharp, electrifying anticipation. Her hands trembled as she made the final adjustments to her equipment, but the tremor was no longer just from the sickness. This time, her science was not a weapon. It was an extension of her senses, a translator for a language she was only just beginning to comprehend. A portable mass spectrometer and a water chemistry analyzer, her finest instruments, were connected to a series of probes resting deep in the heart of the spring. She wasn't here to debunk. She was here to listen, to measure, to witness. She looked at Malachi, who stood with his eyes closed, a leather pouch held in his hands, and she gave him a single, sharp nod. It was time. Malachi's voice, when it came, was a low, resonant chant that seemed to rise from the very stones beneath his feet. He spoke the ancient words Kaelen had heard before, but now they held a different meaning for her, not the sound of superstition, but the sound of a key turning in a lock. Slowly, one by one, the townspeople joined him, their voices weaving together into a low, harmonic hum that vibrated through the clearing. A sound so pure and powerful it felt like the whole valley was singing. As the chant reached a crescendo, Malachi opened his eyes. With a swift, decisive movement, he upended the leather pouch, casting the finely ground powder of herbs and mineral salts onto the surface of the water. The reaction was instantaneous. The placid surface of the spring fizzed, a million tiny bubbles rising like liberated souls. A faint, sweet-smelling vapor, smelling of crushed herbs and damp earth, drifted up into the cool night air. Kaelen's eyes were glued to her monitors. Her breath hitched. On the screen of the mass spectrometer, a graph spiked wildly. A simple molecule, one that hadn't been there seconds before a lithium-zinc salt compound was flooding the water. And simultaneously, on another screen, the graph that had haunted her, the one she had finally managed to isolate, plummeted. The complex, terrifying signature of the organometallic neurotoxin, the agent of the poison breath, was vanishing. It was being neutralized, disassembled, erased from existence in real time. The ritual wasn't just a ritual, it was chemistry, and it was happening right in front of her. The chanting softened, fading into a gentle hum, and then into silence. The fizzing of the spring subsided, the vapor dissipated, and the air, Kaelen realized, felt different, cleaner, lighter. The oppressive weight that had hung over the valley for weeks was gone. She stared at her screen, at the flat line where the neurotoxin signature used to be, and in a flash of profound, earth-shattering comprehension, the entire picture resolved in her mind. It was all there. The Archean microorganism, a life form from the dawn of time, living deep within the earth and surfacing in the spring. Its life cycle, tied to the immense mineral pressures from the valley's unique geology, which caused it to periodically secrete the deadly neurotoxin, the poison breath, and the cure, the ritual powder. The specific herbs were a catalyst, but the true weapon was in the crystalline rocks, a perfect combination of lithium and zinc salts, a geological antidote that evolution had placed right alongside the poison. Awestruck, Kaelen looked up at Malachi, who was watching her, his expression serene. "The ritual," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "It works. It's a cure." Malachi simply nodded, his eyes filled with an ancient, knowing sadness. "We know," he said. "It is the way." Weeks later, Kaelen's research vehicle kicked up dust on the road leaving Sanctuary Valley. The town she left behind was bathed in warm sunlight, the silence now one of peace, not fear. Inside the vehicle, Kaelen, her face healthy and her eyes clear, was on a video call with Dean Atherton. "So the report is conclusive?" Atherton asked, his image slightly pixelated on the screen. "Yes," Kaelen said, her voice calm and centered. She'd already submitted the document. It was brief, concise, and told the truth, just not in the language he expected. The outbreak was an acute, cyclical neurotoxicity event. It was contained and neutralized via the application of a traditional, botanically derived local remedy, which proved uniquely and immediately effective. Atherton looked confused. "A local remedy? Kaelen, what does that mean in practical terms? What was the compound?" "The compound is site-specific and integrated into the local belief system," she replied smoothly. "My report is accurate. The remedy worked." There was a long pause. Kaelen didn't flinch. She had her data, a mountain of it, but she knew now that data without wisdom was just noise. Atherton sighed, running a hand over his face. "All right, Kaelen, I don't understand it, but the government liaison is satisfied. The crisis is over. Welcome back." She ended the call and looked out the window. The imposing, threatening trees of the valley now seemed like steadfast, ancient guardians. She had her career back, her reputation restored. But she had won it not by conquering the irrational with science, but by learning to see that they were just two different languages describing the same terrifying, beautiful truth. She had gone into the valley to find a molecule. She had left understanding that the world was not a machine to be analyzed, but a story to be read. It is always satisfying when the ghost in the machine turns out to be, well, a machine. An Archean microorganism, a neurotoxin, a neutralizing agent. The science in this story provides a clean, elegant answer to the horror in Sanctuary Valley. And in our modern world, we reconditioned to see that as the final word. The scientific explanation is the real explanation, but the story of Dr. Reed and Malachi Thorne leaves us with a more complex and, I think, a more profound truth. The question isn't whether the science was right, it was. The question is whether it was sufficient. Malachi's superstition, the belief in the breath and the cleansing rite, wasn't just a placeholder for the real science. It was the delivery system. It was a story so powerful, a ritual so ingrained, that it perfectly preserved a complex chemical formula for over 2 centuries, without a single lab or written equation. Kaelen's science could explain the cure, but Malachi's tradition is what kept it. It set what made it accessible when it was needed most. Dr. Reed's final act, her decision to describe the cure in her official report as a traditional remedy, isn't a lie. It's an act of translation. It is an admission that the language of science isn't the only one that speaks the truth. So this leads to a fascinating question. If a superstition perfectly preserves a life-saving truth, does it even matter if the scientific explanation is ever discovered? Let me know what you think in the comments.